It might be the most boring pitch in baseball, the cutter. It doesn't generate as much swing miss as most sliders, it's not in zone as much as sinkers or four-seam fastballs, and yet the three teams that use the pitch the most in the major leagues are all inside the top 10 in team ERA since the beginning of May. So why are sharp teams using a pitch that a lot of numbers say is not really good more than they have at any point in the history of baseball? Let's explore the world of cutters. Cutters are basically offset four-seam fastballs. They're somewhat easy to spot when watching a game, often just not tailing to the right for most right-handed pitchers. Now, if we glance at a pitch plot, most four-seam fastballs are up here because they resist the downward force of gravity and move to a pitcher's arm side. So when you offset the orientation of a four-seam fastball to more of a cutter but stay around the four seams, what happens is it pushes the shape of the pitch to here on a pitch plot. Okay, I get that might have been boring, but it was necessary to provide some baseline info because now we can move to fun cutters. Yes, these start to happen when you deviate from this box on the pitch plot, which I'll call our cutter zone, particularly in this direction. This is where Kenley Jansen's cutter has lived for most of his career. The peak of this shape was in 2017, when it averaged 93 miles per hour with 18 inches of vertical break and 7 inches of glove side movement. If you understand pitch plots or understand pitch movement, this is pure insanity. Think about it in relation to our average cutter. 10 inches more lift and 5 inches more glove side movement. To contextualize this, there have been over 1,000 pitches since 2015 that have comparable shape to this Kenley Jansen cutter. Well below 1% of all pitches thrown in Major League Baseball in that time period, and more than 600 of that 1,000 have been thrown by one guy, Kenley Jansen. And the cool thing is I actually found some old Pitch FX data via True Media on Mariano Rivera's cutter as well. I actually didn't think this exists, but now we can see that his shape in the year 2013 specifically lived around this lift cutter area. His averaged 13 inches of vertical break, 5 to 6 inches of glove side movement at 91 miles per hour, with virtually impeccable command to his glove side. To get into this fun cutter territory, what you're generally trying to do is push the velocity of your cutter or create more glove side break. The problem with this is twofold. If you try to push the velocity on your cutter, what happens a lot of the time is you get behind the ball more. It's just a more efficient way to apply force, and it starts looking a lot like your four-seam fastball, which again is not the intent of a cutter. So the other angle is, okay, let me try to get glove side break. For that, which ends up happening a lot of the time, is you get to the side of the baseball, creating more lateral break, but also creating drop and killing velocity, such that essentially your cutter becomes a slider. Now, the thing with those lift cutters, the Rivera and Kenley Jansen one, is that they're maintaining velocity, but also able to get that lateral movement and achieve some lift. So it's not a slider, not a four-seam fastball. It's this weird territory of cutter that really works. So they achieved it through getting glove side movement, whereas a guy like Emmanuel Clase is basically throwing an average cutter shape about 7 or 8 miles per hour harder than average, which is an incredibly difficult thing to do. Unfortunately, the cutters being thrown by teams using them the most in Major League Baseball are a bit more boring on average. Yes, I know, it's unfortunate. But that, to me, is related to the fastball. I almost view cutters as a byproduct of mediocre fastballs. Most of the better pitching development organizations in baseball prize good fastball shape, or fastballs that generate whiff. I'd throw the Dodgers, Rays, and Tigers into this bucket. The Tigers and Rays are both top 5 in four-seam zone rate in the minor leagues, and the Dodgers and Rays are top 5 in four-seam velocity. But the reality is that the majority of pitchers don't really have great fastballs. And more modern orgs don't really believe throwing a bad fastball more in the minors really does anything for a pitcher's development. This is why we've seen the league push away from the four-seam fastball in the major leagues over the last few seasons. Now, when you don't have a fastball that you can trust to get whiffs, pitchers are being pushed to incorporate cutters to opposite-handed hitters and sinkers to same-handed hitters. This is the mixed diversity idea that I speculated at the beginning of the year might take off and mostly has. The modern decision tree in Major League Baseball for pitching development is basically, can your fastball generate whiffs? If no, you should be throwing cutters and sinkers. If yes, that's great, but also throw some other stuff more. The second question in that decision tree lines up pretty nicely with two teams we ID'd earlier as throwing a lot of cutters. The Guardians and the Red Sox both have average to below average four-seam fastball shapes per Fangraphs Stuff Plus, and as a result, they throw a lot of cutters. Now the Brewers, well, the Brewers help us understand what I think you'd consider more the peak of this trend, one I think more teams will start to pursue. They actually have the best four-seam fastball Stuff Plus grade in MLB and still throw near the most cutters. This is the Goldilocks zone. Maximize four-seam performance, and those without good four-seamers need to be forced into different shapes as soon as possible. This idea pushes down to the minor leagues for the Brewers as well. The four-seam fastballs they throw have the 4th highest whiff rate in the minors, and they throw cutters at the 2nd highest rate in the minors. And the Red Sox are right in this bin as well. Their four-seam fastballs have the highest whiff rate in the minors, and they also lead the minor leagues in cutter usage. The Brewers have just found more major league success applying this philosophy. I think the Red Sox are kind of getting there, but these two orgs are closer linked in their internal philosophies or the bias their models have than most people would think. So we have a good macro understanding here of why an organization might push towards more cutter usage on the whole, but I think it's important to zoom in even more beyond the forest for the individual trees here and talk about specific instances of cutters, which I think really opens up this topic. Chris Langen, formerly of Driveline Baseball, had a pretty amazing thread on cutters that I want to highlight. His idea relates to something called the zero line. Now, if we jump back to the pitch plots we were looking at earlier in this video, the zero line is this vertical line. For a right-handed pitcher, to the left of this zero line is glove side movement, and to the right is arm side movement. As we saw, the average cutter sits about 2 inches off this zero line with glove side movement. One thing you'll hear in baseball circles is that coaches don't want to give a pitcher a cutter because he, quote, can't get past the zero line. Basically, the shape isn't good, so we don't really think the pitch is going to work, so let's not throw it. Now, Langen makes the case that this is a relatively arbitrary line that coaches shouldn't be scared off by. For example, we don't really care if the pitch averages 1 inch of glove side movement versus 3 inches of glove side movement, but we do care if the pitch averages 1 inch arm side versus 1 inch glove side. These are both 2-inch differences, and the improvement is likely of the same magnitude. This is the zero line bias, and it prevents certain arms from being introduced to cutters, particularly those with a fastball axis more around 2 o'clock. So think two-planey shape. And ironically, the kind of pitcher that needs a cutter more than others is the one with that 2 o'clock axis or the two-planey fastball shape, or someone that's just outright throwing sinkers. This is primarily because that slot generally induces better shapes against right-handed hitters as opposed to left-handed hitters. Logan Webb is a fantastic example of this. From 2021 to 2023, Webb was slightly worse versus left-handed hitting. His xFIP was higher by about 50 points. He generated less whiff, gave up more barrels, and his mix was sinker, slider, changeup with occasional four-seam fastballs. At the end of 2024, however, he added a cutter. And through his first 3 months of 2025, he's had pretty even splits, with a noticeable change in his lefty approach that's allowed him for the first time in his career to say he has even splits. And I'm burying the lead here, but Webb's cutter that he introduced averages arm side movement. It's to the right of the zero line, an area that scares off some in baseball. The aggregate info will lead you most often to the right answers, but then coaches that understand what that aggregate info might be missing are really where I think the best pitching development organizations in baseball provide value to their pitchers. You kind of have to ask yourself a question on this. What is the potential return of us embracing this idea in lieu of the information we have saying it's maybe not the best route? And then the other side of that equation is, what's the risk of loss in the situation where incorrect and the aggregate data wins out? I guess you could call this to some extent the cutter equation or the cutter question. And in talking to some organizations, it seems like a lot of teams may have this priced incorrectly, where the risk of loss they're valuing far higher than what it is in reality. They're not as willing to take a shot on a guy like Logan Webb to take him from being a good pitcher to a great pitcher who will get Cy Young votes this season. Now, if you've hung around to this point in the video, we're going to go through something pretty cool. So I mentioned fun cutters earlier, but there's also this realm of cutters I think are unexplored. Remember the kick changeup? Spiking a finger to get the axis of the ball down in order for that pitch to add more drop, induce more whiff, etc. I've been thinking about how that spike applies to other pitches. The most obvious being knuckle curves, but how about cutters? Take, for example, Max Fried. The Yankees have done a great job with seam effects this year in particular, and Fried as a pitcher, I'm still trying to figure out how they optimize. because his shapes have a lot of variance. But the one thing I found is that it seems like he's throwing both a true carrying four-seamer alongside more of a cutter. I spotted this in video of his release, which you can see right here. Now, from what I can tell, last year, Fried just threw the four-seamer on the left, and it had some natural cut. Confusing, I know, but that's just the pitch he had. He didn't have this thing over on the right. This is what you'd call an offset four-seam grip, where it almost looks as if Fried's middle finger is slightly spiked, such that his index finger is the last thing to kick the ball into the axis that's desired to get to the shape they want. This, my friends, is Seam Effects 101, and I think we're starting to broach some cool territories where we may see more stuff like this, essentially creative ways to get the axis into a position at release where you need it in order to create shapes a pitcher otherwise wouldn't be able to access. I think the main things I want you to take away from this video are the flow of how teams are getting to high cutter usage as they try to optimize for four-seam performance and kind of distance themselves from bad fastballs that don't generate whiff. And the other angle, which is kind of the more art coaching side angle, that there's probably more room for guys to throw bad cutter shapes that still have utility in a repertoire overall. And to answer that question I posed at the beginning of the video, which you may have already picked up on, the answer to why are teams throwing a lot of a bad pitch, I think the answer is that for a lot of guys, it might be the only route for them to be successful. And the Brewers have done a really good job with this on guys like Quinn Priester, Chad Patrick, and others. And even with Brandon Woodruff coming back with lower velocity, they push him to more of a lifted cutter shape, and he's been really successful as well. So I hope you took something away from this video. Cutters are fun, they're weird, maybe they're not that good, but they are at least entertaining. I'll see you soon.